Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, had been locked in a cell at Riverrun for what seemed like an eternity. His hands, once known for their deadly precision with the sword, were bound in shackles, a reminder of the man he had been, a man who killed the Mad King to save thousands of lives but paid the price of his honor. For years, the Kingslayer had been reduced to a prisoner, a pawn in the Game of Thrones. But what if he had never been released? What if Tyrion Lannister had never intervened to free him from his cage, and Jaime remained in captivity throughout the War of the Five Kings? Without Jaime's return to the battlefield, the entire landscape of Westeros would have shifted dramatically. For one, his absence would have left a hole in the Lannister military leadership. Tywin Lannister, the patriarch of House Lannister, was a brilliant strategist and a formidable presence, but he could not lead his forces with the same level of skill and courage that Jaime brought. With his son locked away, Tywin's armies would have been considerably weaker. Robb Stark, the king in the north, would have capitalized on this. Without the Kingslayer's military genius at his side, Tywin's forces would have been vulnerable. The battle at the Whispering Wood, where Jaime had been captured, might have ended in a decisive Stark victory rather than a mere victory for Robb. Robb could have used his newfound strength to expand his control over the Riverlands, pushing back the Lannisters even further. But Jaime's absence would not only have affected the military campaign. His return to King's Landing had played a crucial role in maintaining the fragile peace between the Lannisters and the Tyrells. His release had been a bargaining chip that allowed Tywin to secure the Tyrell alliance through the marriage of Joffrey Baratheon to Margaery Tyrell. Without Jaime's presence, the Tyrells might have sought out other alliances, possibly with the Martells or even the Starks. The political landscape would have been in constant flux, with House Lannister finding it harder to maintain their grip on power. Without Jaime and King's Landing, Cersei Lannister would have been forced to rely on others for support. Her relationship with her brother had been complicated, but she had always sought his protection and approval. Without Jaime by her side, Cersei would have been vulnerable to the growing threats in King's Landing, particularly from the Tyrells and the growing influence of the High Sparrow. The absence of Jaime also meant that the Lannisters would have faced a much harder road to maintaining control over the Iron Throne. Tyrion Lannister, though brilliant in his own right, could not command the loyalty of the army like Jaime could. His power had been diminished after the death of Joffrey, and his trial for regicide had left him with few allies. The Lannisters would have struggled to maintain their dominance in the capital without the military leadership Jaime provided. Meanwhile, in the north, the lack of Jaime's influence in King's Landing would have had a ripple effect on the events surrounding the Battle of Blackwater. With Tywin's army stretched thin and the Tyrells possibly reconsidering their allegiance to the Lannisters, Stannis Baratheon might have had a chance to defeat the Lannister forces. The Iron Throne could have fallen into Stannis' hands, and the course of the war would have shifted entirely. Jaime's absence would have also changed his personal arc. Without his release, Jaime would have continued to suffer in captivity, his character stunted and broken. His eventual redemption, where he began to reevaluate his past and his family, would never have happened. He might have died in that cell, never realizing the man he could have become. His relationship with Brienne of Tarth, which had been a central part of his redemption arc, would have never formed. Brienne, without Jaime to rescue or protect, would have pursued her own path, but her role in the story would have been vastly different. Without Jaime Lannister, the power dynamics within King's Landing would have been drastically altered. Tywin Lannister's brilliant military strategy, although formidable, was no substitute for Jaime's leadership and the fear he instilled in his enemies. With Jaime's absence, the Lannisters were forced to make difficult decisions, and alliances that were once secure began to unravel. Cersei Lannister, ever the manipulator, found herself in an even more precarious position than before. With the Tyrells growing more influential by the day and the Mad King's daughter Margaery now married to Joffrey, Cersei's grip on her son's role weakened. Without Jaime's presence as her anchor, her paranoia began to grow. Her mistrust of the Tyrells escalated, and she grew increasingly paranoid about their ambitions in King's Landing. She sought out new alliances with House Martell, but Dorne, still smarting from the deaths of their loved ones at the hands of the Lannisters, did not respond with the eagerness Cersei hoped for. And when Cersei attempted to strike a secret deal with the Ironborn, her plans faltered when they demanded more than she could offer. The Lannisters' power was slipping away. The absence of Jaime Lannister left a hole in the Lannister army, but it was Tyrion who would bear the brunt of this loss. Tyrion, in this alternate timeline, is still the Hand of the King, but without Jaime's military influence, his efforts to control the realm and defend the capital were severely hampered. Tyrion had no love for his family, but he was an astute strategist and politician, and his mind was capable of navigating the treacherous waters of King's Landing. However, without Jaime to back him up, Tyrion found himself beset on all sides by enemies, both old and new. Without Jaime to serve as the Lannisters' greatest military leader, the Tyrells began to position themselves for even greater power. The arrangement between the Tyrells and the Lannisters, born of necessity and mutual respect, was fragile at best. Margaery Tyrell, ever the ambitious player, saw the absence of Jaime as an opportunity. Her marriage to Joffrey was one of convenience, but she had always been a skilled manipulator, and with Joffrey's cruelty growing more pronounced, she began to subtly shift her loyalty toward her family's interests. It was no secret that Margaery's true ambition was to control the throne, and without Jaime Lannister, the Lannisters' hold over it began to weaken. The situation worsened when Robb Stark, emboldened by Jaime's continued captivity, launched a new offensive against the Lannister forces. Without the presence of Jaime's genius on the battlefield, Tywin's forces struggled to contain the Stark rebellion. Robb Stark, unburdened by political entanglements, led a series of raids into the Riverlands, swiftly cutting off key Lannister supply lines and taking back territories lost during the initial stages of Robert's rebellion. With Jaime's absence, Tywin had fewer resources and fewer soldiers willing to risk their lives for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless. Meanwhile, in the south, Stannis Baratheon, still reeling from the death of his brother Robert and the injustice of his family's treatment, began to make his move. Stannis, who had always been the most principled of the Baratheon brothers, saw Jaime's absence as a sign of weakness. He knew that the Lannisters were on the brink of losing their power, and this presented him with an opportunity. He sent emissaries to the Vale, offering a possible alliance to Lady Arryn, who had been left vulnerable after her husband's death. Stannis had a powerful army, and with Jaime locked away in Riverrun, the Lannisters were unable to stop his rise. In the north, Robb Stark's campaign took a turn for the better. With Jaime's military genius removed from the equation, Robb found himself emboldened by victory. The Starks were on the march again, regaining ground they had lost during the early days of Robert's rebellion. They struck swiftly and decisively, with Robb leading his men in brutal assaults against Lannister strongholds. The tide had turned, and without Jaime's strategic insight, Tywin was forced to shift his focus to defending his territory rather than expanding his influence. The loss of Jaime Lannister, once thought untouchable, had brought the Lannister military machine to a screeching halt. But the biggest shift of all was felt beyond the wall. Without Jaime to tie the Lannisters to their dominance over the Seven Kingdoms, and with Robb Stark gaining strength, the threat of the White Walkers grew ever closer. Jon Snow, still in the Night's Watch, began to hear rumors from the far north, rumors of strange happenings of the cold, creeping south. The wall was no longer just a defense against wildlings. It was now the last line of defense against an ancient evil. Without Jaime's return, no one in King's Landing was focused on the true enemy that lay beyond the wall, the Lannisters. Inability to control their realm meant that resources were strained, leaving the wall vulnerable to whatever came from the other side. In King's Landing, the High Sparrow began to take advantage of the growing instability. His influence, though once limited to the Faith Militant, began to grow as the Targaryens' decline and the Lannisters' weakened grip on the Iron Throne provided the perfect opening. The Faith and the Crown were no longer united, and the rise of the Faith Militant gave the High Sparrow a powerful ally. But without Jaime's tactical mind guiding the Lannisters, the situation began to spiral out of control. The High Sparrow's influence reached its zenith, and the religious zealots took the capital by force, further weakening the Lannisters' hold on the throne. Without Jaime Lannister, the Game of Thrones became more brutal, unpredictable, and chaotic. Tyrion, though resourceful, struggled to hold together the fractured realm. The Tyrells, eager to secure their position, capitalized on the Lannisters' disarray, while Stannis began to gather his strength. Robb Stark's victories brought hope to the north, but in King's Landing, the throne was slipping further away from the Lannisters, while beyond the wall, the true enemy was only growing stronger. And in the shadows, Cersei Lannister, realizing the full weight of Jaime's absence, began to unravel. Her madness, fed by paranoia and desperation, grew with every passing day. The absence of her brother had robbed her of her most loyal ally, and her isolation only deepened. Jaime had always been her protector, her equal in cruelty, but now she was left to face the madness of King's Landing alone. As the years passed, Jaime's fate remained a question mark in the annals of Westeros. The Kingslayer, the man who had changed the course of history with one action, was never released to fulfill his destiny. Instead, his absence left a void, a hole in the heart of House Lannister that could never be filled. And so the Game of Thrones continued, but now it was a game of survival, where every player was trying to fill the void left by Jaime Lannister, the man who had never been set free.